many of my constituents in Ohio opened their morning papers to read the shocking news that law enforcement had discovered a human trafficking ring operating in Marion, Ohio, a small town about 50 miles north of Columbus, Ohio. 6 defendants were charged with enslaving multiple victims, including more than 6 migrant children from Guatemala, on egg farms in Marion County, Ohio. The details of the crime laid out by U.S. Attorney Steve Dettelbach were chilling. Traffickers lured the child victims to the United States with the promise of schooling and a better life. The parents of some of the victims even signed over deeds to their properties back home as collateral for debt incurred to pay for the journey. But not long after their arrival, these children, some as young as 14 years old, were forced to work 12 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week. The work was grueling, and the living conditions were squalid, with children packed into a dilapidated trailer. They said that some of the kids were living in mattresses underneath the trailer. To compel them to work, the traffickers withheld their paychecks and threatened their families. As the indictment lays out, the defendants, and I quote, used a combination of threats, humiliation, deprivation, financial coercion, and debt manipulation to create a climate of fear and helplessness. 5 of the 6 defendants have now pled guilty. It's intolerable that human trafficking, really modern-day slavery, could occur in our own backyard in the 21st century. But it does. What makes this Marion case even more alarming is that a U.S. government agency was actually responsible for delivering some of the victims into the hands of the abusers. In 2014, more than 6 of the children found on the Marion egg farms traveled without their parents across Central America to our southern border. When they arrived here, they were entrusted to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, like thousands of other unaccompanied children who have been detained at the border. Under federal law, it's then HHS's job to find and vet a relative or trusted family friend to care for the child until their immigration court date, or else house them in safe shelters. Instead, HHS delivered the Marion children into the hands of a human trafficking ring that forced them into these slave labor conditions we talked about. How could this have happened in America? Well, after the release of the indictment last summer, Senator McCaskill and I launched an investigation to find out. How did HHS hand over a group of children to human traffickers? Was it a tragic failure to follow agency procedures in each of these cases? Or was the problem that the agency's procedures don't work and need reform? These were very important questions, not only because of the Marion cases, but because of the number of additional children who are at risk. Over the past 2 years, HHS has placed about 90,000 migrant children, the vast majority from Central America, with adult sponsors in the United States. That surge of migrant children coming into the U.S. illegally is a topic of some debate. There's certainly evidence that this administration's executive actions on immigration encouraged the surge. But whatever your views on immigration policy, everyone should be able to agree that the administration has a responsibility to ensure the safety of the migrant kids that have entered government custody until their immigration court date. Unaccompanied children are uniquely vulnerable to human trafficking because many are in debt to the smugglers who arrange for their passage. The risk is that the smugglers may then force them to work off that debt once they arrive. That's why federal law specifically provides that HHS protect these kids from traffickers and others who seek to victimize them. We investigated these protections as part of a thorough 6-month bipartisan inquiry. The subcommittee requested and reviewed thousands of pages of child placement case files, internal emails, and other documents from HHS. We interviewed several senior officials at HHS. We consulted with experts in child welfare and trafficking protections. That bipartisan staff report has been issued today, and it details the troubling findings from that inquiry. Our conclusion is that the Department of Health and Human Services process for placing unaccompanied children suffers from serious systemic failures. The horrible trafficking crime that occurred in Marion, Ohio, could likely have been prevented if HHS had adopted common sense measures for screening sponsors and checking in on the well-being of at-risk children. Protections that are standard, by the way, standard in foster care systems run by all the states, including Ohio. And unfortunately, the systemic defects that contributed to the Marion case appear to have exposed unaccompanied minors to abuse in other cases reviewed by the subcommittee. First, the victims of the Marion traffickers were placed with alleged family friends or distant relatives, which are known as Category 3 sponsors. As it turned out, the sponsors weren't really family friends at all. Two of them were basically sponsors for hire, strangers hired by human smugglers just to get the child out of HHS custody and then immediately pass them on to traffickers. HHS did not know that, though, because it does not insist on any real verification of the supposed relationship between the sponsor and the child, apart from the say-so of a relative. One Marion case file actually contains no explanation at all of the child's relationship with the sponsor or his family. We learned that this kind of lax relationship verification is standard practice in Category 3 placements, a lost opportunity to protect these kids and others. Second, HHS missed obvious indications that the sponsors in the Marion cases were accumulating multiple unrelated children, a sign that should have triggered greater scrutiny for the risk of trafficking. A review of the Marion case files reveals an interconnected web of sponsors of multiple children sharing the same address. HHS failed to connect any of these dots. Third, remarkably, HHS didn't visit a single sponsor's home to interview the sponsors and assess the proposed living conditions before placing them. We have learned that home studies are universally conducted in foster care placements, a close analogy to this situation. But HHS has done them in only about 4% of these unaccompanied children placements over the past 3 years. Only about 4%. This policy, of course, places thousands of children at risk every day. Fourth, HHS's procedures for what to do after a child is placed with the sponsor also failed. Only one victim of the Marion human trafficking ring was the subject of any kind of post-release home visit to check on the child's well-being. But shockingly, the adult sponsor was allowed to block the child welfare worker on contract from HHS from visiting that child, even after the caseworker discovered the child was not living at the home on file with HHS. As a result, the government missed another opportunity to uncover the crime being perpetrated. Incredibly, this was not a mishap. It is official HHS policy. HHS allows sponsors to refuse post-relief services offered to a migrant child, even to bar contact between the child and an HHS ORR care provider attempting to provide those services. Basically, when a sponsor says no, the caseworker is instructed simply to write, "Case closed." Finally, and this is hard to believe, at the time of these cases, if a potential sponsor said on his application that he lived with 3 other adults and that if anything happened to him, a backup sponsor could care for the child, which is sometimes required, HHS policy was not to conduct background checks of any kind on any of the sponsor's roommates or the backup caregiver listed on the form. None. Backup checks were only run on the sponsor himself. And this is even more incredible to me. If that check turned up a criminal history, HHS policy was that no criminal conviction, no matter how serious, automatically disqualified a sponsor. On these points, however, I can report that in response to our 6-month investigation, just this week, HHS strengthened its criminal background check policy effective January 25th, as outlined in our report. This is progress. But I continue to be troubled by the fact that HHS told us that it is literally unable to figure out how many children it has placed with convicted felons, what crimes these individuals committed, or how that class of children are doing, how they're faring today. The bottom line is that this is unacceptable. HHS has placed children with non-relatives that have no verified relationship with the child, who receive no home visit or in-person interview, whose household members have unknown backgrounds or criminal records, and who can freely cut off social workers' access to the child. Worse, when senior HHS officials were alerted to trafficking risks due to the Marion cases and other evidence of children working in debt labor, they failed to adequately strengthen their policies, despite the fact that the Senate Appropriations Committee tells us that HHS has more than $350 million in unspent funds for this very program over the past 2 years. That's for this program, $350 million in unspent funds. Perhaps the most troubling unanswered question is this: how many other cases are there like the Marion trafficking case? The answer is HHS doesn't know. The subcommittee has reviewed more than 30 cases involving serious indications of trafficking and abuse of unaccompanied children placed by HHS over the past 3 years. But human trafficking occurs on a black market, and other forms of abuse occur in the shadows. The department maintains no regular means of tracking even known cases of trafficking or abuse, and it does little to monitor the status or well-being of the tens of thousands of children it has placed. There are, in the words of one leading care provider, untold numbers of effectively lost migrant children living in the United States. What I can say with confidence is that HHS's policies expose unaccompanied minor to an unreasonable risk of trafficking, debt bondage, and other forms of abuse at the hands of their sponsors. That must change. Today, we'll seek answers from the administration and discuss a path forward toward what I know is our shared goal of strengthening the system to protect every child in America. Without objection, the Joint Staff Report and the appendix to the report will be made part of the record. With that, I'd like to turn to our ranking member, Senator McCaskill, for her opening statement. And I want to thank Senator McCaskill for being a good partner on this investigation, for working very hard on this issue, and for her passion for these kids. Senator McCaskill.